Neo-Segregation and the Institutionalization of Racial Preferences. My name is John Seiler. I'm Senior Fellow and Director of University Policy at the NAS, and I will be moderating today's event. In just a moment, you will hear from our panelists, but first, I wanted to give you an idea of what you can expect from today's event. After I introduce our speakers, they will each have 12 to 14 minutes to speak. At the conclusion of their remarks, I will read questions from you, the audience, to our panelists. So please, as you are listening to our distinguished panelists speak, think about questions and enter them either into the chat box or into the Q&A box, and I will keep track of that so that I can ask these questions when the time comes. If your questions don't get answered, you can send them to me at Seiler, S-A-I-L-E-R, at nas.org, and I'll forward them along to our panelists. The event will also be recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent to the email address you used to register. So thank you very much for joining this event, and without further ado, I will introduce our speakers for today. Mr. Peter Kirsanow is a partner with Benesch Labor and Employment Practice Group. Mr. Kirsanow was appointed by George W. Bush to the National Labor Relations Board and to his first term on the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, where he has served 3 consecutive terms. Mr. Kirsanow received his bachelor's degree from Cornell University and his law degree from Cleveland Marshall College of Law. Dr. Robert Maranto is the 21st Century Chair in Leadership at the Department of Education Reform at the University of Arkansas. He previously taught at Villanova and served in government in the Clinton years. He received his bachelor's degree from the University of Maryland and his PhD from the University of Minnesota. He edits the Journal of School Choice, and he is author of several books, including Educating Believers, Religious and School, Homeschooling in the 21st Century, President Obama and Education Reform, and the Politically Correct University. Finally, Dr. Peter Wood is the president of the National Association of Scholars. Previously, he served as provost of the King's College in New York City and as a tenured professor of anthropology at Boston University. He is the author of A Bee in the Mouth, Anger in America Now, Diversity, The Invention of a Concept, Wrath, America Enraged, and co-author of Separate but Equal, Again, Neo-Segregation in America in American Higher Education. Dr. Wood attended Haverford College, Rutgers University, and the University of Rochester, where he received his PhD in anthropology. Now, without further ado, I'll ask Mr. Peter Kirsanow to begin the webinar. Peter, go ahead.
Thanks very much, and hello to everybody. You probably, if you've gone on campuses anytime in the last 30 years or 40 years, you've seen a resegregation of campuses, and it's been fairly profound and it's accelerating. It started probably about 55, 60 years ago. Thomas Sowell talked about it during his experience at Cornell, where I went 50 years ago and experienced the same thing shortly after Thomas Sowell left. And it probably, to a large extent, is due to a couple of factors. The most profound one, in my estimation, is mismatch. It's something that we've talked about in the past, that Professor Richard Sanders documented quite copiously, and also kind of a cultural dislocation that occurred back in the 60s when Black students first came on campus at some universities. And if they'd been there before, there wasn't necessarily a large cohort there, or a cohort that would make people necessarily feel comfortable. But because of mismatch, and by mismatch, as many of you already know, if this is the National Association of Scholars seminar, you all are well versed in it. The mismatch is fairly significant. Black students at many schools are significantly less qualified based on objective metrics such as GPA and SATs than their white and Asian comparators. And because of that, Black students matriculating at some of these schools have a difficult time competing academically. That's part of the reason why there was a resegregation, both in terms of classes and dorm rooms and in activities and just spaces, recreational spaces. The other one was kind of a cultural factor, and to some extent, some later years, a cultural imperialism that took over. At Cornell, there was an Ujima house, a house that was devoted to Black life and was a Black residential dorm. That was, Ujima house has some identical houses at other universities, but they may be named different things than Ujima, although I think there's at least 2 or 3 other Ujimas that I'm aware of. And what happened there was you had a lot of Black students that coalesced there. I will tell you that when I went to Cornell again 50 years ago, I didn't get the little packet that most students got that said, okay, here's when you show up. This is your dorm room. Here's what you do. I didn't get that. Something happened with the mail. Don't know what it was. But also because when you have a last name Kirsanow, I think sometimes your name gets lost when you talk about Black students. Nobody knew who's going to show up. And I was recruited principally, not because I was bright or anything, although I had all the grades and the SATs to compete, regardless of what my pigmentation was, but I played some pretty good football. So I went up when the football players went up. What I didn't know was there had been an orientation for Black students well before that. Black students had been on campus for several weeks prior to the rest of the students showing up, that is the freshmen showing up. And as all of you know, because you all went to college, in the first few weeks of going to college, you form relationships that persist throughout your entire tenure. These are durable relationships. You remember these folks, you're going through kind of a traumatic situation, leaving home, going to a place where you don't know anybody. And that was the case with this, what was called the Committee on Special Educational Projects, or COSIP program. All the Black students had been up on campus for a couple of weeks, getting to know each other. And then what happened is Black students in large measure were assigned dorm rooms with other Black students. When I got on campus, I had another Black football player assigned who was in my room, who's my roommate. And again, there was the Ujima house in addition to that. And what I saw almost immediately was a de facto segregation. And it persisted throughout those 4 years, as I indicated. The problem with it is, as you might expect, its segregation is not good for a variety of reasons, one of which is there's no, as the Grutter case likes to say, cross-cultural understanding. And by the way, as you know from that Supreme Court case, one of the purported justifications for racial discrimination on the basis of admissions was the educational benefits that purportedly flow from a diverse student body. Well, if students are self-segregating in dorm rooms, in recreational activities, in graduations, and a whole host of affairs, where do those educational benefits come from? We know that that was simply made up rationale, but nonetheless, somebody needs to answer that. And maybe we'll get the answer when the court decides Students for Fair Admissions against Harvard. We all have our own view of the direction in which it's going to go. I happen to think that the court, I am not necessarily that confident that the court is going to completely do away with racial preferences in admission, but we'll see what happens. My colleague Gail Harriet and I have a brief, an amicus brief, along with about 6,320 others, where we make certain arguments similar to what I've just talked about in terms of mismatch, but also giving the court a perspective on all of the neo-segregation that's occurring on campus. If, again, the purported benefits of a diverse student body are to flow, it presumes that these students are going to be interacting with one another. And it seems as if our university establishment's doing everything they can to accommodate the segregationists, everything they can to promote a kind of cultural imperialism that is not helping the academy whatsoever. So I'm not sure if that's our time frame, but my summary of this is that this is largely derived from this continued mismatch, academic mismatch that we have, that is the result of racial preferences and also cultural dislocation. The cultural dislocation is far less more important than it was 50 years ago, but it's still a component, and it goes beyond cultural dislocation to kind of cultural imperialism, where we divide on the basis of race and we elevate people on the basis of race unless you are white and to a lesser extent Asian. Asians are discriminated against in admissions, but now everybody's got their own dorms, with the exception of whites. You've got Asian dorms, Latin dorms, Black dorms, gay dorms, transgender dorms, all kinds of dorms. And I'm not sure what that has to do with pedagogy at all.
Thank you so much, Peter. Bob?
I'm so glad to hear you say that. And actually, I'd be really curious before I launch into this. It sounds like you've read Thomas Sowell's Black Education, Myths and Tragedies.
I read as much soul as I can.
That is wise. I think it's the best book until Peter Wood, the Dion Pierre and Peter Wood book on Neo-Segregation, which really is in some ways a Sowell part two. I think Sowell's Black Education, Myths and Tragedies from 1972, the middle part of which talks about Cornell, is probably the best thing I've ever read on Blacks in education, and like a lot of Sowell stuff. I'm going to say a couple of things. One is that one of the tragedies here, I think, is that there really is, I think, in some respects, certain white privileges, and I sort of realized that. I'm from a blue collar family in Baltimore. We were, economically doing fine. We had a long standing family business. My grandfather started in 1914 when it was an Italian ghetto, and then over time with the Great Migration, it became a Black ghetto. But our business stayed put, and like any teenage boy of Italian immigrants, I had to work there through my teen years. And the folks I work with were pretty much all either Italian or Black. The night crew actually was Italian, the day crew was Black. And I pretty quickly realized something, that but if I were Black, I'd probably be dead, because in Baltimore City, law enforcement was and still is quite bad. It's a lot better in the county, and it's even worse if you're Black, and hoodlums sort of know that, and they'll pick on Black people in ways they won't pick on white people. Schools weren't very good. I mean, my blue collar white schools weren't terribly good, but at least I wasn't beaten up for reading books. I was just bullied a little bit. And I realized I did have some advantages just being white. And of course, the biggest advantage was just I had a two-parent intact home. But virtually everything liberals do makes this worse, right? They're not making it better. They're making it way, way worse. But they really believe they're doing the right thing. And that kind of occurred to me in the early 90s. I taught for a year at the University of Pennsylvania. And so I'd drive a couple of days a week from the Philadelphia suburbs into the city. And I'd cross City Line Avenue, Route 1, which is in some ways the broadest street in the world. And I'd go from places that were virtually all white and rich to virtually all Black and blue collar and sometimes poor. And I realized, I lived in Lower Merion for a while, years later, I realized that to most rich whites, they don't really understand blue collar people generally. They especially don't understand Black and Hispanic blue collar people. They don't have any understanding of how class and race work. And so they come up with these ideas that maybe in their own rarefied world make a certain amount of sense, but in the real world make no sense at all. And Sowell really captures that in his book, Black Education. Before I get to that, I'll mention something else. I've had a lot of reminders recently. Just a couple months back, I study education, mostly K-12, but some higher education. A couple of my collaborators and I, we have the first empirical work ever on Black female principals, kind of an important thing. There's been about 60 case studies. We have an actual empirical work. And we were told implicitly by one journal and very explicitly by a second journal that we couldn't publish on this because we're not Black. And one of us is white, two of us are white, one's Asian American. I just published something on bullying of transgender kids. I'm not transgender. I guess I slipped in under the wire. In 6 months, I won't be able to publish stuff like that. This idiotic notion of racial essentialism, which is taken hold in the academy and in much of upper class, mostly white society, is a poison. At the same time, I got an email from a friend at University of Connecticut. University of Connecticut Ed School is holding its first ever segregated professional development. Whites all go to this session, BIPOCs, Indigenous people of color, et cetera, go to this other session. I'm like, wow, the Ku Klux Klan would strongly approve of this, right? I mean, this is just crazy talk, but we're doing it constantly. And I guess, Scott Adams' recent comments, he would sign up for the white one quite gladly. Like Peter, I think this is not really the right way to go. And it's idiotic. But a lot of people really believe in this, mostly rich whites, but some other folks as well. So how did we get here? And I would say we got here chiefly through bureaucracy. Bureaucracies have ideologies and that are created mostly when they're formed, and the ideologies lead to standard operating procedures, telling them how to do things. And bureaucracies are also characterized by groupthink. And I don't want to, in all case, criticize bureaucracies when you have very routine things to do, like paving roads or delivering the mail. Having those standard operating procedures can be very good things. But in so much of what government does, so much of what society does, we don't really have good standard operating procedures for what to do. And there's a huge political science literature on this. There's also the budget maximizing bureaucrat literature that every bureaucracy almost always wants to increase its budget and figures out ways to increase its mission and power and budget. Standard operating procedures, if you look at how we lost in Vietnam and Afghanistan, it was essentially doing military SOPs and not thinking about how they were working in those situations. If you look at Graham Allison's wonderful book on the Cuban Missile Crisis, Essence of Decision, the Air Force wanted to bomb because it's what they do. The Navy wanted to blockade because it's what they do. And the Marines and the Army wanted to invade because it's what they do. Bureaucracies, once they have a thing to do, that's what they want to do. But also we got here partly because of managerialism, the notion that we can count the number of Black students or BIPOC students and really have a sense of what's going on and whether things are working or not. And that's kind of absurd. If we want integration to work, we should rediscover the work from the 1950s, Gordon Allport's contact hypothesis, in his book, The Nature of Prejudice, and other works that actually guided school integration a lot. It guided, even before Allport was writing, it guided integrations in organizations like the U.S. Postal Service, where my dad worked for 35 years, where back in 1940, his boss, who commanded 50 people, was a Black guy. And it wasn't considered unusual, at least in Baltimore at that time, or not terribly unusual. A lot of blue-collar organizations, the U.S. Army most notably, but also the Postal Service, followed the contact hypothesis. So what is it? It says that integration works best when people have close contact with each other, when they're not segregated, and when authorities support them having close contact with each other, when they have common goals or overriding identities, like postal worker, like Army, like soldier, or like American. When they earn common status and have common abilities. If we were going to try to make the NBA reflect America, it wouldn't work, right? It's just, that's not going to happen, probably ever. But if we're going to make elite, if we're going to make MIT reflect America demographically, that too is not going to work, at least not in the short term. We've forgotten the contact hypothesis. And I would argue part of the reason why is the period in the late 60s and early 70s when today's diversity bureaucracies really got going. And the dominant ideology of the left then, and certainly still today, was that it was partly one of racial essentialism, that there are two kinds of people, rich whites and poor minorities, and they didn't really look at long-term social capital. They didn't really look at academic performance and things like that. They'd have a very simplistic lens that essentially, if you stopped discrimination, everything would be great very quickly. And it's incredibly silly point of view. Thomas Sowell's wonderful essay, Three Black Histories, which I'd commend to anybody, was really one of the first things I read on race, the blue collar kid, that made sense, that looks at how flawed that is. And it was also partly a racial essentialist ideology that your race defines you. In Sowell's wonderful book, way before other people did, he talked about mismatch. He looked up the records of Black students admitted to Cornell. Sowell himself, who's an economist teaching at Cornell, he left a year before the Guns on Crisis campus in '69. I have to explain to my kids, yeah, back then the left were the ones carrying the guns. It wasn't right-wingers. Sowell actually developed a program to try to prepare and recruit more talented Black undergraduates across the country to get PhDs in economics. It had some success. He wanted, and still does, want to integrate elites. But you can't do that by lowering standards. At least you can't do it effectively. It's one of the key contradictions of the contact hypothesis. Just like, if you put me on the football team because you needed some new white guys, it wouldn't work. It just wouldn't work. Sowell and administrators, including Black administrators and faculty like Pearl Lucas, were hamstrung by mostly white folks who had a different approach to this. who wanted to, as Sowell put it, admit blacks who fit their, not who could compete academically at Cornell, but who fit white liberal stereotypes of what blacks were supposed to be, which is performing not quite as well academically, from rougher backgrounds, from the inner city, et cetera. And Sowell documents a number of cases where African Americans who could have done quite well at Cornell were turned down in favor of people who couldn't do as well. You met these folks on campus, then you erect a bureaucracy to serve them. And that bureaucracy, largely reflecting leftist whites, supposedly reflects their interests, but really doesn't, and grows and grows. And you turned a lot of people who should have been successes at, say, the State University of New York and Albany, a pretty good school that actually turned me down when I applied there in the 70s as an undergrad, or SUNY Brockport or SUNY Binghamton, which also turned me down. You took kids who could have succeeded at those schools into failures at Cornell because they were mismatched. And the bureaucracy doubled down on that. Once bureaucracies have a budget and ideology, they're not very good at admitting when they might be wrong. A second part of this ideology, of course, was the notion that a true minority has to be a victim. So this struck me back in 2014. The Smithsonian Institution had a wonderful, well, really not very good display on South Asians in American life. And they highlighted a number of South Asians who, one way or another, were victims of white oppression. At this time, there were two governors, Nikki Haley of South Carolina and Bobby Jindal of Louisiana, who were both mentioned as possible presidential candidates. Nikki Haley still is. They were not considered worthy of note, partly because they're conservative and partly because they don't define themselves as victims. If you don't define yourself as a victim, you're not considered a minority in the eyes of the left, which runs higher education, which runs mainstream media, et cetera, et cetera. And this limits the teaching of Black history in all kinds of ways. I'm doing work now on Marcus Foster, who nobody's heard of, unless you're in Philadelphia and were touched by his life, and a lot of people were. He was an amazing educator in the 50s, 60s, early 70s. He was also the first Black big city school superintendent. Nobody's heard about him today. And partly it was because, although he was by no means a man of the right, he did believe in personal responsibility and he did believe in academic success. But also, he was not killed by the KKK. He was murdered by the Marxist Symbionese Liberation Army, an inconvenient fact for the left. So nobody's heard of this really amazing historical figure. Go back to Thomas Sowell a bit. His wonderful, definitely read his book. It is the best thing out there. But also read his 1999 article from Education Next, which is online, Education Next and the Weekly Standard, The Day Cornell Died, where he talks about the development of diversity bureaucracies, which then gave us entrenched interests in many respects in Black failure. And even in '69, in the Cornell crisis, we're doing hate crime hoaxes to claim you have to increase our budget because there are these horrible hate crimes, which in at least two cases were hoaxes. My friend Wilfred Riley wrote a pretty good book on this hate crime hoax, on hundreds of hate crime hoaxes. Again, something the media doesn't really cover, which is a shame. So what do we do with bureaucracies that have ideologies that don't work? My view is you have to either totally remake them or defund them. And that's not only true of left-wing bureaucracies. I've written pieces arguing that we might want to do that with the Baltimore Police Department. It is so ineffective, we might be better off if we got rid of it and started over. Some right-wing bureaucracies also need to be totally remade. A lot of left-wing bureaucracies do, and diversity bureaucracies are certainly in the list. They're doing more good than harm because their ideology of how integration can work is simply scientifically wrong. And I'll mention Craig Frisbee and I have a book on that coming out next month, published by the National Association of Scholars, where we have a bunch of the scientific evaluations of the way diversity bureaucracies tend to do diversity, how they tend to ignore the contact hypothesis and do integration. And with that, and that's a good setup, I think, actually, for Peter Wood, who wrote a wonderful, like I said, in a way, a sequel to Black Education, Myths and Tragedies. Their wonderful book, free, you can download it, on neo-segregation at Yale and other schools. And I'll stop with that.
Right, Dr. Wood.
Thank you. Well, I think this is a rich and complicated topic, and I really appreciate Peter and Bob's entries into it. I'm going to try to do something slightly different so I just don't repeat what has already been said. Broadly speaking, we social scientists look at the explanation for events as one of two broad paths. That is, there's something called path dependency, which means basically you continue to do what you've already done, and where you started makes a big difference to where you end up. The other is the idea that where you begin doesn't necessarily explain why you're continuing to do it. And those two things both need to be kept in mind. There's considerable truth to both. The path dependency idea takes us into historical explanations of why we are where we are. Both Peter and Bob gave versions of the historical explanation. And I'm going to do some of that too, but I want to hold in reserve that there are other kinds of explanation that come into this as well, and I'll try to get to those in this few minutes that I've got as well. But let me start out in the personal vein here, since both Peter and Bob have put some of that in as well. In the fall of 1971, I was a freshman at Haverford College, which is in the suburbs of Philadelphia. It's a Quaker school, which bears on this story. 3 weeks into the beginning of my freshman semester, a cultural dislocation, as Peter would call it, took place. The Black Student Association of Haverford College called a strike. They issued a manifesto, sort of. It was a statement saying, "We're not going to tell you why we're on strike. Look to yourselves, you will know. And by the way, we're not going to talk to any white people until our demands are met." Those demands having been completely unstated. The effect of this event was what I think we would now call a moral panic. My fellow freshmen, most of whom were white, began to sink into a kind of hysteria. There were two students I remember in particular who took a bed sheet and with red ink wrote on it, "I am a racist," a self-accusing way, and they wandered around campus wanting to make sure that everybody knew that they were guilty as charged. And other students were doing things equally bizarre. I grew up in a white suburb and attended a white high school, but I ended up by family accident spending a good deal of my time in a mostly Black neighborhood. And I just couldn't find it in myself to feel this horrible guilt. And I had no idea why my fellow Haverfordians were in such a state of alarm. About a week after this thing began, the administration of the college packed us all, there were about 800 Haverford students at the time, into the one building on campus large enough to hold us in one place, Roberts Hall. And it was an Indian summer day. There's a term for which I could be canceled. Hot and steamy, and the building was unair conditioned, and it was run by Quaker rules, which is to say we were going to reach consensus, and consensus in the Haverford Quaker tradition meant 100% agreement. If one person dissented, there we would sit and continue to discuss until the spirit moved us to agreement. Well, after several hours in which the only proposition on the table was for us to judge ourselves guilty of systemic racism, or whatever they were calling it at that point, slowly the resistors began to peel away until there were just a very few of us left. And then I said, what the hell? I agreed. I left Roberts Hall that day transformed, but not quite in the way in which either the Black Students Association or the White Guilty Party wanted me to be. I'd gone in a kind of conventional liberal. I came out a conservative. I said, if this is what liberalism is about, it's about browbeating, coercion, it's about trying to make people guilty of things they know they're not guilty of. And my life changed at that point. And brings me to this point, although these many years later. So a few years ago, a news item had caught my eye that Brown University in Providence had been holding segregated commencement ceremonies. If you were Black, you got to go to your own commencement, although you could also go to the white commencement. I had on staff at that time Dion Pierre, who was himself Black. I said, well, why don't you go up to Brown and see what you can find out? And while you're there, take a look at Wesleyan and go to Yale as well. So what emerged from this was a project that was essentially an effort to see how deeply entrenched had these new ethics of segregation become. I was moving beyond the idea that we were going to have racial preferences in admissions. Now the question was how much of this had sunk into the other aspects of university life. And of course, I wasn't naive about this. I know a lot of it had, and I'd seen some of it myself, but we were much more systematic about it. And I can't remember off the top of my head, but we came up with a kind of matrix of something like 60 different ways in which you can segregate campus. And we applied this grid to, it was something on the order of 180 colleges and universities around the country, all different types. We didn't want to just get the elite schools. We found only one college in the US, which was a little sectarian religious college, may have been in Arkansas, as for that matter. It had none of the desiderata of neo-segregation, but for the most part, they all did. And this extended to segregated dorms, which we've heard about, segregated orientation sessions, segregated this, that, and the other thing, including segregated alumni. When you graduate from Yale, you don't have to be just a Yale graduate, you can be a Black Yale graduate. We wanted to know where this stuff came from, hence the historical explanation. In the case of Yale, which was one of the very early adopters of neo-segregation, it came about by the misfiring of perfectly good intentions. In around 1961, Yale got serious about wanting to end its segregated university. It had never been entirely segregated. Yale, like a lot of the other Ivy Leagues, had admitted a de minimis number of Black students over the years. So it wasn't completely breaking the mold, but they decided that wasn't enough. And they were right about that. So they needed to go out and find Black students who were qualified to be at Yale. They found precious few of them. So they began to make their very first mistake, which was to lower standards in order to get the numbers. They tried that. Almost all the students they admitted in 1961, 1962, 1963 failed out. They didn't stay. Either they failed out completely or they became so discouraged they just left. And they began to think, well, we have to do something more. Well, something more in the liberal mind always means more of the same. So they began to admit still more students, larger numbers. They tried some interesting approaches. They took the students they admitted and sent them off to a whole year, basically boot camp at a private prep school in order to see if they could bring them up to snuff. Some of those students actually survived, but most of them didn't. But the one thing that really came out of Yale's early experimentation with attempting to integrate their campus was that the Black students themselves began to recognize a deeper commonality. They created BSE, Black Students at Yale, an organization. And when I think it was Brewster Kingman at that point met with BSE and said, well, what do you want? We're doing everything we can. And they said, we hate everything you're doing. You're forcing us to take these courses we don't do well in. You're forcing us to spend time with these white students who look down on us. It's a miserable situation. The one thing we like about Yale, and there is one thing, and we really like it, we like BSE. We like being with each other. So give us more of that. Let us have the opportunity to associate. Now that was around, again, I have to go back to my own text to get the year, but it's about 1966 or so that BSE begins to do this, and BSE gets everything it wants. And when it gets everything it wants, what does it want? It wants still more of what it wanted, and more and more. To sort of short circuit this, by 1971, The other minority groups at Yale were looking at Bisset and said, well, why are you doing so good? You get what you want. So Bisset spawned a whole bunch of other identity groups who wanted the same sorts of privileges. And Yale, being Yale, just gave in to all of them. The one thing Yale never did, interestingly enough, was segregate its dorms. They did every other form of segregation they could imagine, but they didn't do that. So what's happening here? Let me analyze this a little bit. For one thing, I think everybody behaved pretty much as you would expect them to behave. There was goodwill on all parts here. The white administrators wanted to get right with the civil rights movement. They were trying their damnedest to figure out how to do that. The black students wanted to succeed and they wanted to be accepted, but they found that it wasn't really working out for them so well. And one of the reasons was mismatch. They didn't have a word for that yet, but they certainly recognized that their academic qualifications didn't match up with all these prep school students who were making up the majority of their Yale fellow students. And of course, Yale at this point is single sex. The coming of coeducation is a little bit later. So Kingman Brewster ended up doing the exact opposite of what he wanted. He wanted to create a new model of integration. He created inadvertently a new model of segregation. Now that new model was, maybe Yale wasn't the very first place, but it was the very first place we could find. It beat Cornell, it beat Wesleyan, it beat the workings of things at Brown. But the pattern was the same everywhere we looked. It began with good intentions. It ended with neo-segregation. And once neo-segregation got planted, people became very defensive about it. They didn't want to admit that they had failed. So they began to say, no, this didn't fail. This is success. This is what it looks like to have integration. Integration happens to look a lot like segregation, but you just misunderstand. What we have here is a vibrant community in which people can feel their own identities and participate as much as they want, or as little as they want, with the rest of the campus. There were groups similar to Bisset at both Wesleyan and at Brown, and they played out in this same way. The segregated groups, once they realized that there was power in grievance, that being a victim really pays off, found ever more novel ways to claim victimhood and ever novel ways to take resentment and umbrage at how they had been treated and been used. And in a certain sense, they were right. They were being used. They were being used to make the white administrators feel like they had done something important and valuable. They were being used to make the white students feel like we're on the right side of this civil rights stuff going on. We're helping to get rid of the legacy of segregation and racism in the history of our institutions. Why shouldn't we feel good about ourselves? We're trying awfully hard to make things right. Of course, while all of this was going on, affirmative action was taking shape as a policy that was affecting all kinds of institutions, not just elite ones, and a resistance to affirmative action, which again, I think was based on a really sound perspective on things, which was it wasn't going to really help anybody to lower standards and pretend that that's not what you're doing. This culminated, at least temporarily, in the 1978 Bakke decision, where the Supreme Court decided that the University of California Medical School at Davis, which was brand new and couldn't possibly have a history of segregation or racism because it didn't exist, had admitted as among its first students a cohort that included several Black and Hispanic students, and had denied admission to a highly qualified white student named Alan Bakke. He fought his case in California. Case eventually makes its way to the US Supreme Court, where the University of California makes the spectacularly bad decision to say that the reason that it had to engage in racial preferences was that it had to overcome its history of racial discrimination. Not a good case to make when your college had never discriminated. The case divided the Supreme Court three ways: four liberal justices who wanted to say, California, you got it right; four conservative justices who said, this violates the Equal Protection Clause of the Civil Rights Act, and we are therefore down to the final decision, which goes to Lewis Powell, the ninth justice, who ultimately says Bakke has to be admitted, but he issues a very peculiar decision in which he says, you argued it wrong, California. Had you made your argument more centrally about the need for diversity in the classroom, I would have decided this differently. He throws out this concept of diversity. It's the first time that lands on the stage of American higher education. In a certain way, it's the first time it lands on the stage of American discourse about race at all. We had other ways of talking about it before then. No other justice agreed with Powell about this, but the word is out there. It lacks standing as a legal principle, but it's in the Supreme Court dicta. Within a few years, American higher education picks it up. A fear has descended on the affirmative action offices across the land that the Supreme Court is going to take away their basis for operating. And if maybe we substitute the word diversity, we have a better chance of saving our system of racial preference, which we really love to have. So out went affirmative action, in came diversity. Adopting the word and just engaging in wordplay turned out not to be enough. That it never is. The word had its own logic to it. If what you want is diversity in the classroom, you have to do more than just admit students. You have to figure out a way to meet the needs of those students. And diversity became this ever evolving idea of what else we need to do. Well, I don't have the time to track through that entire history, but when we get to diversity, equity, and inclusion today, we are just seeing the latest annexation of additional ideas to a concept that's worn itself out in futility. Diversity was never going to solve the problem initiated by Kingman Brewster of underqualified students feeling the cultural dislocation, the ostracism, or just the discomfort of being in an environment where they couldn't compete on equal terms with other students. So now we need to get rid of diversity per se, or at least augment it with equity and inclusion. The idea of pursuing equality gets displaced by this notion of equity, which is equal outcomes. Inclusion is a very peculiar word that I don't think very many Americans have completely grasped, but it essentially means judge people by the standards of their identity group and not by any kind of standards that purport to have universal effect. Now, how do we get here? Again, lots of history to it, but now I'm going to switch from history to a different kind of explanation, which I'm going to call institutional drivers. And that incorporates some history: the rise of affirmative action with its own logic, the Bakke decision, diversity as a substitute good for academic success, corporate panic, which sets in the late 80s when there's a false belief that we're going to run out of qualified workers by the year 2000. And then the rise again at the end of the 1980s, the very beginning of the diversity consultant business, which has become a huge money-making thing. These are institutional drivers in that, as Bob was saying, there is a sense here of bureaucracy taking a course which it learns how to do well and wanting to do more of it. And once we've got these policies in place that have a certain logic to be played out, play it out, they do. They played it out, I would say, this part I don't think has come up yet, with the rise of a new set of educrats, people who make their living not in the classroom teaching or doing research, but by running the services that the university provides. There's two important organizations in the country. One's called the ACPA, that's the American College Personnel Association, and its rival NASPA, the National Association of Student Personnel Administrators, both of whom existed before there was a purpose for them. they needed to find a reason why they should exist, their importance on campus. Well, I spent a few years as a professional librarian in an academic library before I finished my PhD, and I got used to the sense of condescension that we non-academics had on campus, and that wishing to be accepted, and no matter if you were a librarian with a PhD, you still weren't a professor, so you didn't count. Well, that status sense of grievance, lack of being accepted, drove both ACPA and NASPA to search for ways in which they could assert their own importance. And they found it with diversity. That's not the only place they found it, but they began to see that we can be the voice for transforming higher education. If you look at ACPA's website, their basic purpose is boldly transforming higher education. Transforming it from what to what? Transforming it from a place where you go to become educated to going to a place where you learn to be an activist, and you learn to be guilty if you're white, and you learn to be aggrieved if you're black, you learn some combination of those two if you're Asian. There is this sense among the administrators there that they are the people who have the real interests of the students at heart. Now we have these new doctrines about emotional social learning. Boy, that fits well with what ACPA wants. They want people to realize they're weak, they're pathetic, that they go to college on the verge of becoming mentally disabled or neurotic, and ACPA is going to do whatever it can to make sure that their neurosis blooms into full-scale fear of disaster, whether it's going to be environmental meltdown or race war, or just this understanding that America has been a rotten place from the very beginning. Well, I don't want to put too much weight on those two pathetic organizations, although they deserve a lot of it. But there's also, I should mention, it's a GDIB, which is the Global Diversity and Inclusive Benchmarks, which are endorsed by ACPA and its sister organization, but which extend far beyond higher education. GDIB's benchmarks apply everywhere, and we are not going to be right with history until we get that right. So this institutional drivers patois I'm giving you ends up with a kind of answer to the classic cui bono question. Who benefits from this? Well, there's a large class of people who get their paychecks from American universities who are now wholly dependent on sustaining neo-segregation. Neo-segregation is their payday. And it's not that they don't believe that it's true. They believe in what they need to believe in, but they're also, I have a strong sense here, driven by a degree of self-interest, especially those swarms of people who have now been granted titles of diversity dean, diversity provost, sub-associate, assistant associate provost for diversity, and so on. They literally contribute nothing whatsoever to the legitimate education of the students in their charge, but they contribute a whole truckload of things that are destructive of those students, psychologically, educationally. They interfere with the appointment of new faculty members. They're sit in some sense on every search committee that a university runs for every position. They have a say in what it is that now goes into the mission statements of universities. This is a terribly destructive and almost impossible to extirpate way of going about controlling our systems of higher education. And they come with it as the deep source of the expiation model that has now gripped the minds of tens of millions of students, that the purpose of education now is to rid themselves of all the bad things that were inculcated in them by their parents, or if not by their parents, by society at large. They know somehow they're guilty of something, and it's probably got something to do with race. There is, as I've alluded to before, a kind of social panic model behind this as well. especially since the unfortunate death of George Floyd in police custody in Minneapolis. We have been left with a permission to riot if your grievances are heartfelt enough. And we saw in the summer of 2020, some 300 American college and university presidents issue statements accusing their own institutions of systemic racism, for which many, many more millions of dollars would need to be spent on hiring more people that would fill the ranks of ACPA and such organizations. Social panic has ensued, and it has continued. Now, I'm not quite comfortable in saying this, but I think in sake of honesty that I have to, that this entire model of things fits very well with the needs of the Democratic Party for issues to run on. And it has both been an excuse maker for this and a rationalizer and a funder for these matters. NAS is not a partisan organization. We don't support parties or political candidates as such, but we're not blind to what's going on in the world as well. And it is quite clear that an element of partisan politics has entered into the entire phenomena of neo-segregation with the rise of Nicole Hannah-Jones and the 1619 Project, and it's being extolled to the skies mainly by Democratic politicians. So we're in the midst of all of that. Now, I probably exceeded my time, but I think I will turn this back to John at this point. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wood. And now we'll have a time of Q&A. And as audience members begin to put their comments and questions either in the chat or in the Q&A box, I wanted to bring up one point that demonstrates a little bit of the work that we do at the NAS. Last week, through a public records request, we acquired the University of Missouri's rubric for evaluating contributions to diversity, equity, and inclusion, a rubric that's intended to be used to evaluate the diversity statements that faculty job candidates now need to submit in order to complete their job application. And so I think one feature of this rubric is very much worth mentioning in the context of this discussion, and that is that the rubric dictates a low score for candidates who say that, quote, it's better not to have affinity groups aimed at underrepresented individuals because it keeps them separate from everyone else. So the very objections that have been brought up in today's discussion at the explicit direction of these DEI officers that we've mentioned, that very objection is now enough to earn a job per a faculty job applicant a low score and potentially derail their application.
I'm going to jump in quickly and boast a little bit. My Ed Policy PhD program is 4th ranked nationally, and one of our students, James Paul, did his dissertation on, in part, one of the 3 chapters was on required DEI statements, which was issued by AEI and also just published in a actually left-leaning higher education journal. And I'd say anybody out there want to get a PhD and study this kind of stuff and then get a job afterwards, we have great fellowships and assistantships, but these are really important areas we need to study. And I actually would support them if there was evidence that they succeeded in any of their stated purposes. And the evidence is complete that they fail in virtually all of their stated purposes, while also taking away freedom of speech and putting us back to 1950s loyalty oaths. And we need more attention to that empirical work showing that. We also need politicians to have some guts. Republicans took over one house of Congress. I don't see them holding any hearings on anything like this, which is bizarre. And I see a couple of Democrats. I'm going to give credit to Eric Adams, the new New York mayor, who have in some ways taken on parts of this in bringing back phonics to the schools, or starting to restore effective policing, et cetera.
So, Bob, I'll go ahead and get us started with questions. I have a question for you. Early on in your talk, you made an interesting comment that some of the impetus for this, the rise of this neo-segregation, is managerialism. Can you say a little bit more about the connection between kind of the diversity bureaucracy and managerialism?
Yeah, and it's a bad managerialism. We count who we have in different ethnic and basically victim boxes, which first off, people lie a lot about that stuff. Quite a few people lie about their race and such when it suits their purposes, and always have actually. But we also we don't look at deep understandings of what's going on. So we don't. I mean, I'm fond of saying that as an academic, honestly, it's a little hard to be a conservative white academic. It's way harder to be a conservative black. You're sort of pushed in a certain box, and whites in particular will see you as disloyal if you don't follow that organizational box. I don't think we spend nearly enough time trying to figure out what's actually going on. So I'm fond of asking DEI folks at behind the scenes at my universities, and others will say, okay, we have all these DEI programs. We know, we have evidence that after 4 years in the military, blacks and whites are more likely to have cross-racial friendships, to date cross-racially, to like each other's music, right? The little bit of evidence we have from universities is it's working the opposite way. People are less likely to have friendships after 4 years. And I was asking, well, how is it like at your university? Have you studied it? And if the numbers are bad, what are you doing wrong? What do you need to work on? People are never prepared to have that discussion. So it's not just managerialism. It isn't just running things by numbers. It's stupid managerialism. It's how we won in Vietnam and Afghanistan, right? These are not well-functioning organizations.
Right. The question for you, Dr. Wood, his member named Karen asks, how do you want universities to address the issues you mentioned in your critique? She adds, continues to ask, do you think that Republicans are stirring the political pot with their rhetoric as well?
Well, I mentioned a lot of issues, so I'm not sure which of those would be most direct to Karen's question. I would say that higher education best serves everybody when it holds to a clear set of standards and transparently tells the public what those standards are. We have a very large system of higher education in this country, somewhere on the order of about 4,000 institutions of many different types and many different locations. Very few of them have highly selective admissions policies. For the most part, if you're a high school graduate, and even if you're not, in a lot of cases, you can get into a college. And if you get into a college on the basis of some combination of your proven ability and your determination, your commitment to success, you probably will succeed. The problems that we're talking about tend to be, as someone put it not long ago, rich people's problems, or in this case, rich institutions' problems. It's the elite colleges and universities that feel this nagging desire to inflate their numbers of minority students by admitting minority students who lack the credentials to be there. That's a problem, and that problem can easily be addressed as our Justice Roberts put it in a similar way some years ago. Just stop doing it. If you admit people on the basis of their actual ability and credentials, you will get plenty of minority students. They may not be the minority students you want. It turns out that people from West Africa do extraordinarily well in American higher education. People from the Caribbean do pretty well. People from inner city Baltimore, not so well. Sorry, Bob. Now, it doesn't mean they can't. There are deeper problems here of how we go about trying to educate our children in schools in places that are socially deprived. But a lot of those deprivations are kind of beyond the reach of what the government can do. Broken families raise broken children, or at least children who are not competitive with children who have the advantages of a two-parent family. Those are big, important social problems. They're not going to be fixed by any university in the country. The second question had to do with are Republicans throwing gasoline on the fire type things. Well, yeah, some of them are for sure. I don't think it's something that can be taken as a party platform on the part of Republicans. There is a set of issues here that it's clearly difficult for politicians of any party to grapple with because it is so darn uncomfortable. But I give some credit to any politician of any party who is willing to say, this is a real problem and we need to address it.
Let me jump in. I probably should let the other Peter talk, but let me jump in and make 2 points. One is what we're doing reflects bureaucratic interests, right? And one thing we're doing with universities generally is we're dumbing them down and putting more and more teaching online and hollowing out the teaching force. And that's just empowering the bureaucrats. Professors matter less and less, bureaucrats matter more and more. But a second thing, it reflects interest in a broader way. There's enormous support now among upper class whites for affirmative action because chiefly, or for racial quotas really, because chiefly what it's doing now is keeping Asian and occasionally African immigrants from taking their places in elite schools. And that's the reality of a lot of this. I think it's unfortunate. I'd prefer to go with more of a merit system, but I get why privileged people want to maintain their privilege. I think the rest of us, though, should have a lot of fun making fun of them. So when a college university does a land acknowledgement statement, why don't we start having petitions saying, give the land back, right? Why can't Yale do that? They could do that, right? Or at least pay the local tribes some money. When Harvard says it is profited from systematic racism, well, they have a $40 billion endowment. The top 16 HBCUs in the country have a combined endowment of around $1.4 billion. I think I have an idea for how we could fix this. And indeed, Betsy DeVos, when she was Secretary of Education, bailed out a lot of HBCUs. She did more for HBCUs arguably than any ed secretary in history. I would challenge Harvard to do better if they really think they're guilty of systematic discrimination. We on the right should be having a lot of fun with this, right? When people at Harvard say to defund the police, why don't we say, hey, start with the Harvard University police. Your students can be protected by the police of the city of Cambridge like everybody else in the city of Cambridge, right? We should be having fun with this and pointing out elite hypocrisy, and we're not doing it. It annoys me.
Peter,
I personally did not vote for Mr. Trump. I saw a few too many issues, but I see why a lot of great people did. A lot of it was elite, total and complete corruption, elite hypocrisy. I get it. We should be taking over that mantle, and it can be bipartisan.
Another audience member asks a question that's a little bit similar to the last, but I think it's worth specifically asking, and that is, it appears that DEI has inculcated itself into the very genome of academic, political, and corporate life. What is there to do to reverse this process? I think each panelist probably has an opinion on this, and so Peter Kirsanow, we'll go ahead and start with you and go in now reverse order.
Well, we could talk for a long time about this, but the first thing to do is recognize that much of what we've talked about is unlawful. This is plain unlawful. We've been talking about the merits of it, from a philosophical perspective, but I have filed as a commissioner a number of complaints with the Office of Civil Rights of the Department of Education on things such as segregated dorms, segregated graduations, segregated benefits of all manner. And it's a clear violation of the law. Mark Perry, Professor Perry of University of Michigan at Flint has done yeoman's work on this, but he's one individual. There should be significant monies being directed at this because it hurts everybody from a philosophical perspective, from a legal perspective, but also it hurts purported beneficiaries dramatically. There's considerable evidence that the purported beneficiaries of, of affirmative action that leads to this neo-segregation do far worse in their outcomes than those who do not benefit from affirmative action, who got in on their own merit. This is so bad on a host of levels. And let's face it, I don't want to wax philosophical again, but It's un-American in its essence. We had a shining moment for a couple of years after Martin Luther King said, content of character versus color of skin. And I think people glommed onto that for a while, but it quickly changed, as Peter Wood indicated, into the diversity scam, into neo-segregation. And we're at a point now where you've got the beneficiaries of affirmative action. It depends on where they stand, but in general, up to 4 times more likely to flunk out of their schools than their non-preferred comparatives. That's not a good outcome. At the Civil Rights Commission, I recall that years ago, we had a student who testified before us, and I may get this wrong because it was at least almost 20 years ago, who had been admitted pursuant to affirmative action, flunked out before the end of, well, didn't flunk out, but she could see the trajectory, so voluntarily withdrew before the end of her first year, and wrote a scathing letter to the president of the university saying, why did you admit me? I believed that when I was admitted, because I was qualified to compete here. So I entered under that assumption. And it turned out I wasn't qualified to complete here. I wasted a year of my life, tuition, etc., and it also affected my psyche. That's happening manifold, 100,000 times a year now. And we're saying we're doing something good. It's an abomination. It should be called out as such. It's unlawful. It should be called out as such. It needs to be dismantled because this is harming America and not just Black Americans, but Americans generally. And we have dumbed down the academy in so many areas as it's not even recognizable anymore. What are we producing? When we talk about not having talented a pool of workers in the future, what do you think that is? Part of the reason is the necessary dumbing down of instruction to accommodate the beneficiaries of affirmative action. This is not helping anyone.
Let me add, we are hugely dumbing things down, and DEI bureaucracies are playing a big role in that. I've always thought something the federal government should do is to say that if you want federal Pell Grants used at your school, you should have to publish the SATs or ACTs, some standardized test, of different pools of applicants by race. And the reason, and this kind of hit me personally somewhat, our daughter is at one of the country's top engineering schools. And initially we honestly, we know that if she were Asian, she wouldn't have gotten in. And if she were a guy, we're pretty sure she wouldn't have gotten in. And we went over the numbers and we decided it was okay for her to go because her test scores put her right at 50th percentile at that school. And so the SAT showed that she could compete there and she's actually doing quite well. But if her SAT scores had put her in the bottom 15%, she would have gone to a good state U. And I think that we need to enable parents and students to make those decisions, to know, okay, was I admitted here because I'm a legacy, or because my daddy bought a building, or because I play basketball, or because of my race, or am I suited to compete in an average major, in the major I want at this place? We could easily amend the higher ed bill to require that if you wanted Pell Grants. It would be hard to get institutions to do it, but I think we could. And I think parents need to know that. Right? I mean, they need to know, am I sending my kid off to slaughter, or are they going to have a good chance of succeeding there? And as Sowell pointed out 50 years ago in Black Education Myths and Tragedies, an engineer from Virginia Tech is going to do great. They're going to do great. An engineer from MIT is going to do great. The difference is the work at MIT will go a lot faster. And a lot of people who would do great at Virginia Tech are going to fall behind at MIT, and it's not going to be a good experience. And I think we need to have honest and open conversations about that. And sometimes, and that doesn't mean things will always be perfectly balanced racially, right? My son's very good engineering school was mostly South Asian. There was only one white guy he ever worked with. Actually, they were all South Asian or East Asian, pretty much a few Hispanics. My daughter's school is predominantly East Asian, and that's okay. That's fine. That's not a terrible thing.
Well, let me follow up on that for briefly. About 15 years ago, there was a bill pending before Congress that would do precisely what Bob had just indicated. That is, it would require the display of a number of metrics that would give students and their parents an idea of what the probabilities of finishing out in their particular major, where they would probably end up in grade point average based on prior experience, and other metrics that would give them an idea as to, if I go to this place, given my LSAT, my SAT, my grade point average, what's the likelihood of not just admission, what's the likelihood of graduation, and where am I going to end up with respect to GPA? That didn't go anywhere for several reasons. One was because we had too many pusillanimous Republicans who at the time had a majority and probably could have gotten it done. What happens is we have got this presumption on the part of too many Republicans, unfortunately, that they think they can't talk about these issues. What they fail to understand is that the majority of Americans, pursuant to any poll you want to look at, agrees with them on steroids.
Yeah.
But everyone is too afraid to talk about it, so they don't push initiatives such as this. The other thing is, to go along with what Bob said, we had a hearing a number of years ago at the Civil Rights Commission with respect to, again, probabilities of graduation, probabilities of success after graduation. And what we found is when Black students who might have had an option of going to a school that would admit them pursuant to affirmative action versus going to an HBCU, when you take them all similarly situated in all respects, those that go to an HBCU have a higher degree of staying within their major, especially if it's something like a STEM program,
Right.
and then graduating at the end of it, than those who go to a majority school pursuant to affirmative action. Because what happens is they go there, they think they're going to be an engineer, find out they can't compete, and then go into a softer discipline or don't graduate at all. So
Peter,
we're talking about billions of dollars in wasted money. We're
Right.
talking about massaging weak individuals who think that, my goodness, this is great, this DEI. I don't know what the heck I'm doing in DEI, but we're doing it. It's a bureaucracy, as you indicated, and we're not educating at a time when we're competing with China and other places, and we're suffering badly.
Peter, this discussion, your discussion suggests you actually care about student outcomes, which is very unusual in this area, right? People act as if students don't exist, except as numbers, which is appalling. The other thing I'd say here is people need to see race and cultures of all kinds as things that are more malleable than they are. If you looked at it in the 1890s, in the North, the lower classes were predominantly Irish. And as Thomas Sowell points out in Markets and Minorities and his book on American Ethnic Groups, groups are not, if we have a reasonably well-working set of institutions, over time, people shift where they are, if the institutions work. Right now, they're not.
I guess I'll throw my 2 cents into this. The question was, what can we do to change the path that we're on? And as an anthropologist, I think cultures do change. It's pretty hard to architect how they will change, but they can be nudged. I would maybe start by saying that my solution here would be to create 10,000 John Seilers and set them loose against the institutions of higher education, because John has figured out the knack for embarrassing these places into doing something better. Well, he's of course not alone in that. There is a rising number of people who are working on this same path. Now, Peter Kirsanow brings up the need to just enforce the law, and for sure, but you can't really enforce the law unless you've got the spirit of the public consent behind you. When every major corporation has annealed itself to the diversity doctrine, where every college university president thinks it's a matter of survival to declare their guiltiness in the current indictment against legacy institutions, something more has to be altered in this path. It has to do with persuading people that they will have wholer, better, more meaningful lives and lives for their children if they can overcome the fearfulness and ignorance which together lock them into this readiness to accede to the race hustlers that are running the system for their own benefit. We need, and this society can only ever succeed with some combination of confidence and individualism. When we divide ourselves into identity groups, we divide ourselves perilously towards the path of dissolution as a coherent social entity. We are in the midst of that kind of dissolution. It can be stopped, but to stop it, we need the courageous leadership of our political class, but also the courageous leadership of people in every other kind of institution. The National Association of Scholars, since we can do some self-advertising here, I will say, is playing a role in that. We are trying to be the voice for a civilization that is worth sustaining, and we're doing so against the ferocious opposition of the higher education establishment. I can tend to continue doing what we're doing, and my staff and the people who have joined NAS, I believe, are on the right side of this street, and it's not going to be an easy fight. It's probably going to be a multi-generational undertaking, but we know where we need to go. There are all across the country these groups popping up, like the old Parkland Conference group, basically Black leaders who are concerned about the culture of victimhood that is derailing Black success in this country, but all kinds of groups. And some of them are going to find their footing in higher education, which I applaud, but there are many other places to go to work as well. In the corporate world, we now face this ESG phenomenon, which is environment, social justice. It's basically a left-wing capture of the corporate boards. And, it's bad news for those of us who consider that not so long ago that the purpose of corporate boards was to ensure a profit to their investors of all races. Now it turns out corporate boards exist to make sure their companies don't have better products or sell them better, but rather they're there to engage in the kind of racial and social justice appeasement that has already absorbed the universities.
Let me make, if I can jump in and make two comments. One is, in a lot of ways, we're in the 1920s. In the 19-teens and 20s, and John Zimmerman shows us in his wonderful book, Who's America? Culture, Wars, and Public Schools, kind of the Confederate propagators of the lost cause myth sort of imposed or sold the view, sales job, that the Civil War wasn't really about slavery, and really slavery wasn't that bad, right? That's what people taught a lot. And what we've allowed in the last 30 years to happen is the people who lost the Cold War, Marxists, are imposing the view that really Marxism worked and was wonderful, and America is all about discrimination and so on. And I think that may hold lessons. One is, this is going to probably take decades, but it can be overcome, especially with a little political courage. And now I'm going to ask Peter, who do you see as political leaders who could lead us out of this? I think the Florida governor, possibly. I actually think Mayor Adams in New York, a liberal Democrat in most respects, but in both schools and policing, he's very unwoke, very un-DEI. Who are other people that might, in the next 5, 6, 7, 8 years, lead us in a different direction? Because in a lot of ways, people don't like this stuff. People really do not like woke. Whenever it's put to a vote, it loses. And so in a lot of ways, to take another historical analogy, what we sort of have is universities or East Germany in 1986. Nobody likes the system. It's bureaucratic, it's inefficient, it doesn't serve anyone but the people running it. But who has the courage to overturn it? Where's our Lech Walesa? Where's our Gorbachev? Where's our where are people like this who are going to start undoing this?
Which Peter are you asking?
Both of you, but I think mostly Kirsanow, because he's more politically clued in.
Well, here's what I would say. There are only a few people that actually have the clout to lead any kind of a movement like this. And of course they are. You mentioned Ron DeSantis. Right now, he's, kind of the shooting star. And, the guy that everyone loves to hate, Donald Trump. Donald Trump galvanizes this kind of motivation more than anyone I've seen in the last, I've ever seen, frankly, on the Republican side. Republicans have been acting for a long time as if they're guilty. They're afraid to raise this issue. It's unfortunate. And, there's a lot of explanations for it, but the explanations are not excuses. It must be done. And as I said a few moments ago, One thing that everyone reacts to in America is litigation. Everyone hates it. No one wants to be on the receiving end of it. Okay, I'm a lawyer. This is what I do for a living. I know that if I file a complaint, all kinds of hell is going to break loose. In this case, that's a good thing. If we had more people doing this, and it's easy, you don't have to be a lawyer. If you file a complaint with the Office of Civil Rights, it's going to take them forever to adjudicate it because they hate your guts. They don't like what you're doing. The people who are running the levers of it are completely opposed to you. They're not discharging their essential mission. Get that right. But nonetheless, they've got a job to do. And maybe at the end of the day, it may take a couple of years. Finally, there's going to be a sanction imposed, but the real sanction comes in receiving that complaint. If you are the president of the university, and I've done it, I have seen it, we have stopped segregation at a number of universities or unlawful programs by the mere filing of a complaint and the publicity attendant thereto. It works. They really hate the publicity because the fact of the matter is, they, I think, understand implicitly that the majority of Americans who don't have a voice are opposed to this. So when it's publicized and publicized in a neutral fashion, they shrink away from it. And a lot of these people are people of goodwill. They think they have to go along with this. There's certain funding that comes with it. But even their donor groups, the alumni with the big bucks, many of them are not woke, and they welcome this kind of challenge. So for those of you who are listening to this, it's a simple procedure to do. I'm not saying it's going to happen overnight. I'm not saying you're necessarily going to be successful, but it's part of the building block to get rid of this, and it's effective.
Peter, do you have your handbook on this? This sounds cool.
All right. So we are about to move into closing remarks where each panelist can give a 1 or 2 minute summative closing remark. But before then, I just want to thank everyone for joining us for this event hosted again by the National Association of Scholars. Before our closing remarks, I want to take a moment to first of all say that if your question was not answered, feel free to email me at Seiler, SAILER, @nas.org, and I'd be happy to send your questions and comments along to our distinguished panelists. I also wanted to take a moment to say that if you enjoyed the webinar, there are several ways you can help us continue to make them. First, if you are not already a member of the NAS, please join. It really does help us, and you will get special access to this and other events hosted by the NAS. The second thing you can do, if you are already a member of the NAS or you simply want to go the extra mile, is to donate. You will find links in the chat below that will let you learn more. And the third thing you can do is share the video of these events and tell others about them. It's really been lovely to see more people join these webinars each week, and we want to continue to reach as many people as possible. With that, I'd like to turn it over once again to the speakers for 1 or 2 minute closing remarks, and we'll just go in the order in which the speakers presented. So Peter Kirsanow.
Yeah, I'll just simply add what I said before because I think it's imperative. Find a university, college that you believe is segregating on the basis of race and hit them between the eyes. I'm not going to sugarcoat this. Hit them hard, file a complaint, publicize it, send a copy of the complaint to the local television station, radio station, newspaper. Let them know this institution is discriminating on the basis of race. We can talk as much as we want, but unless we apply a sanction, this is going to persist forever and ever, amen. Because as both Peter and Bob indicated, there are institutional imperatives to perpetuating this. There is a huge diversity, equity, and inclusion establishment out there who do nothing but gaze at their neighbors and make pronouncements as if they're coming down from on high, that this is the essential feature of academic instruction in America today. Hit them hard because it's hurting everybody. It's hurting our country and our social fabric. But most specifically, it's hurting the purported beneficiaries for the reasons I mentioned before, and it's hurting all students. It is dumbing down society necessarily. We can't afford this to happen because now we're no longer isolated. We got to compete against China. We've got to compete against Russia and everybody else, and they're going to eat our lunch if we continue this diversity navel gazing.
I think I'm next. I mean, I would agree, maybe not quite as strongly, but I would agree. I mean, I would just say 3 or 4 things. One is know that social movements take a long time, but have patience. do what you can where you are, and don't be alone. There are groups now like FAIR that NAS and others can link you up on. There are people like Peter out there. Don't act alone, act with others, and try to understand the people you're going against on these things are not necessarily evil. A lot of them mean well, but we've done a ton of research on this, and we know that what they're proposing doesn't work, and we need to constantly say that. And the final thing I guess I'd say is have hope. And here I'm going to push back a little bit on Peter. I think that there are things like bad education in places like Baltimore and bad law enforcement in places like Baltimore that we've actually, not in Baltimore, but in some places we've had enormous success on. There are things institutionally that we can really do that would protect people better and that would make us a more equal country in terms of race, class, and all kinds of ways. But they're not the things that DEI is promoting. They tend to be exactly the opposite. And so we'll leave it at that. Have hope and do what you can with where you are with others.
Well, I will simply say I want to thank Peter and Bob. I think your closing remarks in both cases, though quite different, are right on the mark for this. What I would recommend doing is two things. One is that you're not the problem if you're on this call or have attended this event. You're aware of the nature of the difficulties ahead of us, but you have to talk to other people. You have to make this part of your conversation. And I know how very difficult that is. You can be fearful of the results. In some cases, they will be unpleasant. But the only way you change a culture is by changing the conversation in which that culture is propagated minute by minute, day by day. The other thing is that pay attention, and pay attention means more than saying simply, I don't like the bad results of neo-segregation or DEI and so forth. To get anywhere on this, you have to be ready to look very closely to what is actually happening at the institutions that you're familiar with. And it may be your alma mater, it may be the college that you work at, it may be just the symphony orchestra that you attend, or it's everywhere. And everywhere, when you begin to pay attention, you begin to see how insidious this thing is. So it's that combination of being willing to talk to your neighbors and friends and family, and being informed when you do as to what is actually happening around you. So that's my go forth and do better. And thank you for attending this event.
A great note to end on. Once again, thank you to our panelists, and thank you so much to everyone who joined. I think it's been a wonderful conversation.